I'm very happy to introduce our speaker today. Our speaker is Dr. Ent Halvorsen, and he is a senior instructor at the American English Institute at the University of Oregon, where he primarily trains pre-service and in-service language teachers in both face-to-face and online courses. He has PhD in education from the University of Illinois, with a focus on bilingualism and biliteracy development, and a research specialization in program evaluation. Andy has been involved in English as a second language and English as a foreign language instruction, teacher training, curriculum development for over 15 years. And he has worked and taught in the United States, China, Japan, Thailand, Albania. Also, Andy has given numerous conference presentations around the world, and he has authored a range of peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. So welcome, Andy, and thank you for agreeing to participate in this webinar and share your experience with us.
Thank you, Yelena.
Okay.
Shall I begin?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Let me turn on my video. Good morning to everyone. I say good morning because it's early in the morning here in Oregon. I know that it's evening time where most of you are, but early morning for me. However, I have my coffee this morning, so I am prepared for the webinar at 7 a.m. So thank you very much for the introduction. As Yelena has mentioned, I have a range of different experiences in ESL and EFL, primarily in teacher training work over the last 4 or 5 years. And I have had the opportunity to visit, travel in, and work in quite a few different countries. However, I've never had the opportunity to visit Kazakhstan. So this is my best virtual visit to your country. So I'm happy that you've had me here today. Thank you all very much. I am going to be talking about assessment today, and I'm going to try to give you a general overview of some of the important principles of language assessment. And I'm going to do that by showing some slides on my PowerPoint. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now so that you can see my PowerPoint presentation. So give me 1 minute here. Okay, now I hope that you can now see my screen and my PowerPoint. Is that correct? Yelena, can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes, Andy, I can see, and I would like to encourage the participants to be more active, reply to the questions, and if possible, switch on the video so that our speaker can see your reaction.
Yes, it's a little difficult in a webinar context because I can't see the faces of my students out in the world. I can't see if you are nodding or smiling or sleeping or what you're doing out there. That's okay. I will assume that everyone is listening carefully to my words. You can see on the first slide here, overview of language assessment. That is my goal for this 1-hour workshop today. So I would like to start with a little cartoon. The cartoon has to do with assessment, and this is what we're talking about. So let me just give an overview of this cartoon, if you don't mind. You can see the students here. I see a bird, for example. I see a monkey. I see, what is that, a penguin, an elephant, a fish, a seal, and a dog. So in terms of students, we would say there is good diversity here, right? There's a diversity of students. Some of them have 2 legs, some of them have 4 legs, some of them live in the water, some of them live on the land. A wide range of diversity in terms of students. However, you see the teacher saying, for a fair selection, everyone has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. So the teacher maybe has good intentions here, right? The teacher is suggesting that we want to be equal to all of the students. We want to assess them all fairly and equally. So he's giving the same exam to all the students. And that exam is Please climb that tree. Hopefully, you can see the obvious problem here. Some students are set up for success on this particular exam. The monkey, for example, he can pass the exam before even beginning the class, correct? However, a student like the goldfish could study in this class for months and years and its entire life and never successfully be able to climb the tree. Why is that? It's because the assessment doesn't line up correctly with the background of all of the students. So we're going to talk about this issue a little bit more in terms of alignment between the activities that you do in the classroom and the things that you want from your students. Okay, so let's get through a few key terms in language assessment. One thing that sometimes challenges students and teachers also is this notion of evaluation versus assessment versus testing. And they are different things. However, I will say that in many of the books that you look at, in much of the literature that you might read, sometimes people merge these ideas together a little bit. But I would like you to remember that they are, in fact, different concepts. So, for example, evaluation is the broadest and biggest term. This is used when you're looking, for example, at an entire program of study. So I have another job outside of the University of Oregon where I do language program evaluation. And that means that I travel to different organizations, different universities, and I look at their entire program. I look at the students, I look at the faculty, I look at the finances, I look at the curriculum, I look at everything. And that's a formal, very broad evaluation. That's a big term. But if you narrow it down a little bit more, the concept of assessment is a type of evaluation. It's part of an evaluation. But assessment is specifically looking at how you measure student language proficiency. And that's a little bit different thing than the very broad evaluation. And how do we measure student language proficiency? Well, there's a lot of different ways to do that. But important to understand, a test is just one type of assessment. It's one way to think about how to measure student language proficiency. It is not the only way, and that's important to understand. So we'll talk about some forms of alternative assessment in just a couple of minutes. So here's a little triangle to kind of illustrate visually what I have just said. Evaluation is bigger and broader. Assessment is a little bit more narrow, and testing is the final, smallest concept. Testing is just one type of assessment. Another key term to think about is this difference between criterion-referenced and norm-referenced tests. These might be new terms for you, I'm not sure. But a criterion-referenced test is a check if students have met the objectives that you have set for a particular course. They measure how much learning has occurred in a course or how much learning has occurred in a space. A norm-referenced test is a different type of test. It's usually what we talk about in terms of like a standardized assessment, a standardized test. They measure global skills of language, and they actually specifically compare one student to another. So you get a score, and that score marks you against other students or other takers of the test. So I'm wondering, I have a question here at the bottom, and maybe someone can speak up and let me know what you think. Do you know of any norm reference tests out in the world? Are there any norm reference tests that you're familiar with? I'm opening up my chat window to see if I have any. Oh, okay, good. Now I can see responses from many people. The PISA, the IELTS, yes, sorry, I just switched slides. Okay, so I see people typing in the IELTS test, the PISA test, the TOEFL test. Yes, these are all good examples of norm reference tests. These are big standardized tests that compare your language skills to others. So thank you for that, that's excellent. Another couple of key terms to think about here, formative assessment versus summative assessment. Formative assessment happens during the course, and this is important. The goal is to use the results to somehow change or improve instruction and student learning. Summative assessment happens usually after the course or after the task has been completed. And this goal is to measure what students have actually learned only. So these are very different concepts, but sometimes teachers bring them together in their mind a little bit, I think. So let me just give an example. Formative assessment, I said here, can be very informal. For example, if you ask students to participate in a group task in your classroom, you do group work. What does the teacher usually do during group work? Well, usually the teacher will walk around the classroom and facilitate the groups, right? The teacher will listen to the students talking in groups. The teacher might make some notes on a piece of paper to consider how the students are speaking, what they're talking about, and what kind of grammar mistakes they're making. What is the teacher doing as the teacher is walking around and listening to these groups? They're doing formative assessment. It's a very informal way for the teacher to understand whether the students are properly making use of the language. And afterwards, usually the teacher will walk up to the board, for example, and say, okay, thank you. I heard a couple of small mistakes while you were speaking. Let me give you a couple of examples of the mistakes I heard. You're using the formative assessment from walking around the classroom to improve the instruction that you provide. That is formative assessment. That's really valuable assessment for the teacher and for the students. Another form of assessment is summative. And this is when you give your final test at the end of the class. This is when you measure whether the students learned or didn't learn. Again, those are very different concepts. Teachers need to be aware of both parts of assessment, I think. All right, let me move on to talk about alternative assessment. You've probably heard this term, but usually when I'm training teachers, they ask me questions like, alternative? Alternative to what? And another question, can you list some types of alternative assessment for me? Because I don't quite understand this. And then teachers also often want to ask me about what I feel are the most and least successful. So these are some different questions that I get from teachers. And just to give you some idea about possible different types of alternative assessment, I think I have a list here on my next slide. Yes. So I see some people typing into chat, things like portfolio, for example, group work, pair work. This is great. So let me show you the short list that I made. Peer assessment. One student assessing another student in the classroom or at home. Self-assessment. Students assessing themselves. Some teachers are afraid that students might not be very honest in self-assessment. I found the opposite to be true. I found students to be too honest and too hard on themselves often during self-assessment. Portfolios. I saw portfolios mentioned in the chat. Excellent. When you collect all of students' work over a period of 6 weeks or 10 weeks, and you look at the progress of the student work throughout that period of time, and you evaluate them on their progress. Rubrics. I'm going to talk more about rubric design in a few minutes because it's such an important part of assessing productive language skills. Performance-based assessment, have students perform something, do something in the classroom. Exhibitions, demonstrations, very often used in science classes, for example. My daughter is 9 years old doing science at school. A lot of her work is demonstration and exhibition work. Journals. Students writing self-reflective journals, keeping track of their own learning. And observations. I do a lot of evaluations and assessment of teachers. And when you assess teachers, one thing you have to do is go into their classroom and observe their behavior. So observations are another form of alternative assessment. Okay, questions at this point. I've gone through a range of different terms. I've talked about different types of alternative assessment. Are you confused about anything at this point? Do you have any questions at this point?
So, dear participants, if you want to ask a question, you just unmute yourself, or you go to participants and there is a button, raise hand. So you can raise your hand and ask a question. And please use audio. because this will allow us to make our webinar more interactive. And I see a question in the chat.
I see the question as well. Yeah, I just wanted to wait and see if I heard any audio questions, but that's no problem. I do see a question in the chat, so I will address that question and then I will go ahead and move on. So the question I see here is self-assessment really doable? And that's a very common question. I hear this a lot. Andy, we can't do self-assessment because students aren't fair to themselves. I encourage teachers to think about self-assessment as one piece of the assessment puzzle. I don't think you should only have students doing self-assessment. However, I do think self-assessments can be a very reliable and valid piece of the assessment puzzle, like I said. So you can balance self-assessment with something like peer assessment and also a final formal assessment from the teacher. So if you have three different pieces, you have three different pieces to evaluate the student's full performance on. And I do think it's important to hear what students have to say about their own learning goals and objectives and whether they are meeting those goals. And that's what self-assessment is. And that's valuable, I think, for the teacher. So yes, I do think self-assessment is doable and reasonable and important, but it's one piece of the assessment puzzle, I would say. All right, that's a great question, thank you. Let me move on now and talk about some of the key terms in assessment. Okay. We call these sometimes the cornerstones of assessment, or key terminology in assessment. And I guess you've probably seen some of these words before. I've just used some of these words, validity, reliability, for example. But you might not be 100% confident and comfortable in your knowledge of these terms. So I'm going to go through each of these in just a little bit of detail to give you some background information about them. And then we'll switch over to talk about rubrics and rubric design a little bit, because rubrics can help so much with many of these cornerstones. So let me start with validity. It sounds like an easy concept, but in practice, it's more of a challenge. Validity is the idea of this question right here. Does the test measure what it's designed to measure? Sounds easy, right? So if you are assessing grammar, for example, does your test clearly focus on your grammar objectives for the class? Are you accidentally assessing a little bit of reading or a little bit of writing when you want to focus on grammar? That's a question for validity. Now, again, this seems like an easy concept, but let me give you an example of something that I've seen happen a lot. So here's an example of a validity issue in the classroom. Imagine that you're teaching a listening course and you want to give your students a listening test. Happens a lot, right? This is not surprising. You're in a listening class, you want to give a listening test. Your students listen to an audio file and then they answer multiple choice questions. Now, here's my question at the bottom. What is the problem with validity for this listening test? Can you see a challenge to validity here? And I'll check in the chat and see if people are responding, but you're welcome to speak out loud as well. I'm just monitoring the chat now and watching. I'm seeing one response saying unknown grammar and vocabulary. That's definitely the right idea, yes. So we talked about validity being the question of whether the assessment actually measures what it says that it measures. We're calling this a listening test, correct? Your students listen to an audio file and answer multiple choice questions. Well, the multiple choice questions are on a piece of paper, and they have to read the questions and circle the correct answers. This is a problem because you are giving a listening test, but when you ask students to sit down, read the questions on paper and circle the correct answer, you're also mixing in an assessment of their reading skills. So imagine, and this happens a lot in the United States, imagine that you have a student in your classroom with very advanced listening skills, very high, but they have reading difficulties. That student could fail this test, even though their listening skills are very high, because they're challenged by the reading of the multiple choice questions. So you can see that this is a validity problem. You say that you're giving a listening test, but actually students have to read the questions and respond. So if they have a reading difficulty, they would get a low score on the listening test. This is a challenge to validity, and it's something teachers often forget to think about a little bit. So that's validity, and I hope that example helps clear it up a little bit. Let me mention now reliability. Does the test produce the same results each time? Is it a reliable test? This is a hard question. You need to think about the design of the test, how many questions, the type of questions. You need to think about the students. Are they tired today? Are they awake? The administration, the room, the length of time, etc., etc., etc. If you give a test to two different groups of students and you want to give the same test, you need to make sure not only is the piece of paper the same, but you need to make sure all of the testing conditions are the same as well, correct? Probably you've taken tests or given tests in rooms that are too loud, for example, or too cold, for example, or too hot, or too windy, or too bright. Many, many challenges to the room. If you give a test to 10 students in a large, comfortable room with air conditioning, and you give the same test to 100 students in a crowded, hot, loud room near the street, that's not fair to the students. That's a challenge to reliability, because some students are in a situation where the test will be a little bit easier for them. Other students are in a situation where the test will be harder, not because of their language knowledge or their language skills, but because of the environment around them. So reliability is the idea that the test will produce the same results every time you give the test. And that means thinking about all the conditions relevant to assessment. Practicality. You probably know this word practical already in English, and practicality in assessment is something very similar. Is it too challenging for the teachers to administer the test? Does it take too long to get the results? Is the test too expensive? Does the test take too many hours to administer? Practicality is a huge issue for teachers and for students as well, just based on many of the questions that I have here. Does it take too long to get the results? If you have students waiting 2 months, 3 months, 4 months for the results of their test, there's a problem. Is it too challenging for the teachers to administer? Probably we have all experienced situations where the test administration is a challenge. So I have a question down here at the bottom. Have you ever had to use impractical tests? Has your administration ever given you an impractical situation to do assessment in? I see a large no in our chat window. That's good. If that's true, then you're very lucky. Generally at universities, we have many challenges to practicality for assessment. Yeah, I see mostly multiple choice tests are being offered. Multiple choice tests tend to be fairly high in terms of practicality. They're not as hard to administer as, for example, a speaking role play. All right, let me move on to the next term. The next term is washback. Washback is not a concept that most people have experience with in assessment. So I'm going to give a little bit more detailed explanation here, I think. Washback is the idea about the impact of the test on teaching and learning and on society and on the institution. And with washback, we can have both positive and negative washback. So I talked to Yelena yesterday a little bit, and we talked about this example of the Ent test in Kazakhstan. So I wanted to talk about this test just a little bit in terms of positive and mostly, I think, negative washback. So I hope that you're all familiar with this test. Negative washback examples. So the ENT, my understanding is that this is a national standardized test for students interested in college admission. And this kind of thing happens in Kazakhstan, but it also happens all over the world. It's especially popular and common in Asia, in China and Japan, for example. Standardized national tests for college admission. So I have a couple of bullet points here about the negative washback from a test like this. One example is increase student anxiety, right? I don't know about Kazakhstan, but in China and Japan, during the week of these national tests, suicide rates go up among young people because they're so anxious and so stressed about this one test that will have a big impact in their life and their future. That is an example of negative washback, right? The test itself is causing an increase in suicide rates in the country. That's a problem. It's a problem caused by the assessment. Another bullet point I have here, teachers, that's TTS, teachers must take valuable time in grades 9 through 11 to prepare students for the test. This is, I worked in Thailand, and this was very true in Thailand. During high school, grades 9, 10, 11, teachers were very often canceling the traditional classes that they would be teaching so that they can do test preparation for this very important national exam. When you spend more of your time teaching towards the test, you're not able to focus on the real English skills that are valuable for students. So this is what negative washback looks like. When you have a large assessment that's having negative impacts in society. This is washback.
Yes, and this is very true to Kazakhstan, the same situation.
Yeah, thank you. It is. It's a very large problem generally in many countries across Asia and in Europe as well, I think. Okay, authenticity. Let's talk about authenticity very briefly. Does the format of the test seem realistic and authentic to real life situations? I know that people have a lot of experience giving multiple choice tests in the classroom. They work. There's a problem with authenticity, however. In the real world, we don't often have to sit down and take multiple choice tests, right? It's not a very common skill that gets evaluated in the real world. It tends to not be very authentic. So what I've said here, whenever possible, authentic materials, authentic content should be used in thinking about assessment. Something like a role play where students have to stand up and perform a dialogue is a much more authentic assessment than something like a multiple choice test where students simply sit in a chair and answer grammar questions. So we want our assessments to match real life expectations as much as possible, as much as is practical. Finally, transparency. Transparency in English just means, can you see through something? So the transparency idea in assessment, do the students have a clear and easy understanding of the information about the test? Are the directions clear? Do they know what will be tested? Do students know how points are given? The answer to all of these questions should be yes, 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 and yes. Students deserve transparency. If we want to be fair to our students, we should be as clear and open and honest with them as possible. That's what transparency means. The students should have all of the information about the test before they have to sit down and take the test. Why? Because it's fair to the students, but also because it reduces anxiety for the students. Students get nervous when they don't know what to expect. Transparency is the idea that we tell the students everything so they don't have to be nervous about what to expect on the test. They can just be nervous about their quality of the English they have, not necessarily the content of the test. Okay. I see in the chat, good point about transparency. Thank you, I appreciate that. Cornerstones of assessment. So I've just talked about 6 different points: validity, reliability, practicality, washback, authenticity, and transparency. And I have a question here. How can teachers improve in these key areas? Well, the second part of my talk is going to be mostly about rubrics and rubric design. And I chose to use rubrics because I think rubrics can help to support teachers in several of these areas, the cornerstones that I've mentioned here. So let me move on and talk just a little bit about rubrics at this point, so you can see what they look like and how they can help teachers improve validity and reliability and practicality. So in language assessment, rubrics have become very popular, I would say, in the last 20 years or so, but certainly in the last 5 to 10 years. So let's define the term rubric and maybe look at a couple of examples, because I have several examples here. So what is a rubric? It's a scoring guide, and it's used in assessment that evaluates performance and gives learners feedback. And I wrote at the bottom, why do you think rubrics have become so popular in educational assessment? You don't need to answer that now. It's kind of a question to think about as we move through the next couple of slides. So remember this idea that a rubric is a scoring guide used in assessment and gives feedback to learners as well. So I went through some material from the University of Oregon. I just wanted to give you a couple of small, simple examples of rubrics so you can see what a rubric might look like. This is just one example of many, many, many possibilities. This is a beginning level, low level rubric for a student presentation. You can see the italicized part underneath number 1. This rubric has 3 categories with different weighting, different weights. The scoring is simple, which is nice for students to clearly understand. Remember this important point. We want to share rubrics with students. They need to read the rubric, look at the rubric, because they're going to use it to improve what they're able to do. So the rubric should be written in a way that students can see and understand clearly. These are beginning level students. So look at the categories in the rubric. We have assignment, grammar and vocabulary, and fluency and voice. And we have points awarded for each category, 1, 2, 3, 0. And there's a very simple math system. You can total up the points at the end. This is an example of a simple, clear, straightforward rubric that can be used with low-level students. I have one more example, I think. Yes, this is a little bit more complex rubric. And I think I cut part of the rubric off, but I have most of it here. Intermediate level discussion rubric. And you can see how the points are distributed. And you can see the definitions and explanations within each category. Now, I hope at this point you're starting to think, oh, this would be useful. This would be helpful for me as a teacher. I could do my grading more quickly if I had something like this. That's important to think about. I also see a question in our chat about who is developing the rubrics. This is really an important question. I'll talk about it some more in the future of this presentation, but the basic answer is teachers can, of course, design their own rubrics. Usually at the University of Oregon, when we have groups of teachers working together, they tend to sit down in a room together and design rubrics. But there are also online tools that you can use to help you with the rubric design process, and I'll show you one of those in just a few minutes. Okay, so a couple of examples of rubrics so you can just have in your mind what does a rubric look like. And then I have a couple of questions here, and I'm happy to hear your answers or read your answers. Maybe we don't have time for all of these questions, but I would like to know about question number 1. So are you commonly using rubrics in your country? We have descriptors, I see. That's a start. That's a step towards building a rubric. Are teachers often using rubrics in their writing classes or their speaking classes?
So, as I've mentioned before, I started using rubrics for my speaking presentation class with master students. And I started using it after taking an online course from the University of Oregon on assessment.
Yeah.
And it really saves the time and builds transparency, and students know what to expect and they know how to prepare. So this is a great solution for assessment and saving time also both of the teacher and in class.
Thank you. Yeah, I see in the chat also a couple people sharing the fact that they're using or beginning to use rubrics for speaking. So this is great. I think people are getting started with the idea of using rubrics. Rubrics are good for students to self-assess themselves. That's 100% true. I agree with that comment a lot. It's really helpful for students who don't have experience with self-assessment or peer assessment to have a rubric to know exactly what they should give feedback on. So yes, good points in the chat. Thank you. All right, let me move on here. Some advantages of rubrics as I see them, and as you will see in the literature about rubric design as well. After you've created a rubric, they're really easy for teachers to use repeatedly. Okay, and the repeatedly helps us increase practicality. That's important. Second bullet point there, they increase reliability in assessment. Reliability means that the same score will happen each time, regardless of which teacher, for example, is doing the assessment. You've probably heard students say, I don't want to take the test from this teacher because this teacher is very strict and very hard, but this teacher over here, she's very friendly and she's very nice. She makes it very easy for me. That's great, but it's not fair for the students, correct? This is a problem with reliability. If they're choosing one teacher over another teacher because she or he grades more easily, that's not fair. That's not appropriate. And if both of those teachers are using the same rubric, then the students will be much more likely to get the same results from the two classes. So increase to reliability. They can be used formatively to give learners feedback. That's the point I just read in the chat. Yes, of course, we can use rubrics as a formative tool to help students understand and get feedback even before the final assessment. And giving them to students first increases transparency. If you share the rubric with the students before they take the test, they know exactly what the teacher wants. And they know exactly how to get 100% on their assessment. All they have to do is follow the steps delineated in the rubric. This is valuable and important for students. Rubrics, again, my last bullet point there, they make peer and self-assessment easier, and that directly lines up with what I read in the chat, so thank you. Some different types of rubrics to think about. There are analytic rubrics, holistic rubrics, generic rubrics, task-specific rubrics. The basic difference between analytic and holistic is that in an analytic rubric, each of the criterion is evaluated separately, but in a holistic rubric, all of the criterion are folded in together and evaluated simultaneously. Generic rubric is, for example, a speaking rubric that you can use for many different speaking tests. A task-specific rubric is a rubric that you design in your classroom for one specific task that students are doing. Generic rubrics are more valuable for long-term use. Task-specific rubrics are more valuable for particular classroom-based information. So these are just 4 different terms that you'll see related to rubrics. Rubrics help students learn. As a learning tool, I think teachers kind of undervalue and underestimate what rubrics can do. They give formative feedback so students can target their specific language weaknesses. If you give a student a 4 and return the test to them, that 4 doesn't really mean very much to the students. But if you have a rubric, and on the rubric you're able to circle student needs help with transition sentences. Okay, now the student has formative feedback from the rubric about what their problem is, and they can go back to their writing and try to improve based on the feedback in the rubric. Students can also use them to set personal goals based on their expectations in the classroom and expectations of performance. So I think rubrics are really valuable learning tools for students. They are mostly used with the what we call the productive language skills, right? Speaking and writing. Because speaking and writing are more or less performance-based skills. They're language output skills. So rubrics work better to measure productive language skills. But I have seen teachers make use of rubrics to measure listening and reading as well. It's a little bit more of a challenge, I think, to write a rubric for reading, for example. But definitely for productive language skills, writing and speaking, rubrics work very well. So I have a couple of questions here, and again, I'm happy to listen or to read in the chat. Let's focus on question number 1, if that's okay. Have you had any difficulties or challenges with rubrics, and what were they? Or can you see of any difficulties or challenges with rubrics? What might cause problems? Okay, I see one response here, timing, thank you. Great. I see the answers in the chat that I was expecting. The answers are timing. It takes a long time to develop a rubric, and designing them is difficult. Thinking about the criteria is a challenge. Perfect. Those are the answers. Excellent. Thank you. Here are the challenges that I thought of, but again, they line up pretty well with the challenges you just put into the chat, so thank you. Rubrics are hard to write well. Yes, writing the descriptive language for the rubric is a challenge. They take time to create. Yes, exactly, I agree. And they're not traditional. And some teachers really don't, you probably know teachers like this, they just don't want to change. They want to use the traditional assessment methods. Helping students understand and use rubrics takes time and teaching. That's absolutely true. The first time you give a rubric to a student, they don't know what it is, they don't know what to do with it, they don't trust that it's important. So this is a serious issue as well. Some of my quick responses to these issues are on the next slide, I think. Yes, rubrics writing takes time and it takes practice. It does take extra time to design the rubric. However, in my experience, and I'm confident that this is true, I save so much time in the actual evaluation of the writing and the speaking that I'm happy to spend the time creating the rubric because it makes the evaluation process, the assessment process, much faster. So I can grade a large stack of essays much more quickly if I have a good rubric. If I don't have that rubric, I'm having to make guesses about how I'm going to evaluate. It takes me a lot longer. A quality rubric makes me go through the assessment process much more quickly. And with speaking, I can watch performances in class and pretty much immediately fill in the rubric, so it saves a lot of time in the assessment process. And my second point here, there are tools and there are technologies available to help you do it better. So I'm going to show you, I just have a couple of minutes left, but I want to show you this website very briefly. And the website is called RubyStar. And RubyStar is a valuable website because it gives you simple online tools to help you create rubrics that are appropriate for your students. So let me switch my screen here and I will try to get over to RubyStar quickly. Okay. Good. Okay, so now hopefully on your screen, Yelena, can you nod your head? Can you see RubyStar now? Yes.
Yes.
Excellent, thank you very much. Okay, so here I'm showing you the RubyStar website, and I said this is a tool that allows you to more quickly create quality rubrics. So it's a pretty easy website to use. First of all, it asks you to log in. You don't have to. You can just ignore that part. There's no login required, which is a thing I like about this website. So we want to create a rubric. So we come down here to create a rubric. And I'm just going to use the example today of writing, because we often have to create writing rubrics. And after you click on the type of rubric you want, you get choices, and you can see some different choices here. Letter writing, for example, persuasive essay, research report, story writing. So for my students, often I have to ask them to write persuasive essays. So I'm going to click on persuasive essays. And then you get a couple of requests for information. You put your name here because your name will go on the top of the rubric. And then you need to name your rubric. So I will just call it persuasive essay. And this is all you have to do in terms of filling in information. They do ask you for a zip code because you're international. You enter the zip code of 9999. Okay, and then we move down to looking at the rubric itself. You can see across the top, we have the numbers, the scores, and we have 4 above standard, 3 meeting the standard, 2 approaching the standard, and 1 below the standard. One nice thing to see about the descriptive language in RubyStar is that they don't use negative words like poor or bad or not good or weak. We have meets and approaching, right? 2 out of 4, that's a pretty low score, right? That's about 50%. But instead of calling that weak or poor, we call that approaching the standard. It's a little bit more positive way to frame the language. Okay, so now we go over to the categories on the left. And if you look at the first category, we have a drop-down menu and we can choose. Maybe I want to have a category in my rubric for grammar and spelling. Click grammar and spelling. Now this is the nice part about RubyStar. It fills in all of the language for you in each of the categories. So grammar and spelling, a 4, perfect score. Author makes no errors in grammar or spelling. Great. Author makes 1 or 2 errors in grammar or spelling. All of the work of writing the rubric is being done for you. Great. Come down here to another category. We might want to choose, I don't know, evidence. How about support for position? This is a persuasive essay. They need to have support. Includes 3 or more pieces. Includes 3 or more pieces. Includes 2. Includes 1. So we have a range of criteria here for support. And maybe I'll add one more quickly. How about capitalization and punctuation? We're language teachers. This is important. Author makes no errors in capitalization. Author makes 1 or 2 errors. Author makes a few. Author makes several errors. And if you want, you can continue to go down, and you can add more and more categories, as many as you choose. And also important, you can write your own category. If you don't like the language here, and really you shouldn't, because the rubric is for your class and your context, so you might want to make changes. So you just simply click in the box and type in the box, and you can change the words. When you're all done with your rubric and you're happy, you come down all the way down to the bottom, and you click Submit. And then it gives you your rubric. Looks just like this, all nice and finished. And then if I come down to the bottom, I can click on Print, and I can get a copy of my rubric. It's really easy to use. Again, like I said before, you can change all of the words in here to meet your own needs. But in a short amount of time, you can get a printed copy of a nice rubric for you to use for your own classroom space. So I think that's quite valuable. All right, so that covers RubyStar. Let me jump back to my PowerPoint quickly. Okay.
Andy, there is a question from Tatiana. How many categories do you suggest?
How many categories do I suggest? Let me get back to my chat here so I can see. Okay, chat 1, yes. Okay, yes, so I see lots of positive feedback on the RubyStar, so I appreciate that. But in terms of how many categories, that's a difficult question to answer because it kind of depends on the proficiency level of the students. With lower level students, I generally create rubrics that are more simple with fewer categories. With more advanced students, I tend to create more complex rubrics with more categories and more things to challenge the students in terms of their reading and language production as well. So I can't really answer the question with a simple 3 or 4 categories because it really depends on the context and the proficiency level of the students. It depends on what it is you are trying to evaluate in the classroom as well. So the answer is, it depends. Yeah, it's about 7:51 a.m. here, so I am approaching 1 hour of talking with you. I wanted to have a little bit of time. I have to leave in about 5 minutes, but I wanted to make sure I had a little bit of time at the end in case you had any other questions for me. So if you have any questions about this process, anything I've talked about today, I'm happy to answer questions now. But I also have my email address here on the screen. So if any of you have a question tomorrow or next week, you're welcome to email me with that information. Yelena and I talked about collecting some of your questions together and sharing them with the whole group. So I'm happy to do that. And
hello, Andy.
Yeah, yes.
This is Albina talking. You're
Yes, hi, Albina.
From e-teacher program.
Nice to see you. Nice to hear you. Sorry.
I would like to tell you that your program is really great, one of the greatest program, and I've been using your materials in my teacher training in the updated curriculum. ABCD model is just, you know,
yes,
such a brilliant thing, you know. And I even shared that experience on CAST conference with Tatiana Lityakina, our CAST president. And
great.
the participants of that my masterclass was really delighted. Thank you very much for your presentation. This program and your Oregon universities, especially this program about assessment, is just, I don't know, superb. So thank you so much for your information. Really glad to hear you finally.
Yeah, it's great to hear your voice too. I really appreciate having you here, and I appreciate all of your positive feedback. It makes me happy to hear that some information that I have shared with you or with others has also been shared further. I mean, that's one of the great things about being a teacher or being a teacher trainer. We teach people things, and then those people go out and teach other people as well, and it's a cascading process that makes me very happy to hear that. So thank you, I appreciate that.
So, Andy, there is a comment. Could you make some more webinars on rubrics design, please?
I could, yes. So what I would encourage, yes, the answer is yes, I could. What I would encourage is for all of you, all of the people participating today, to go out and practice a little bit. Try Ruby Star, try out a rubric in your classroom, talk to your colleagues, talk to some people who are here today, work together to design a rubric. And then if we want, maybe in 3 months or 4 months, we can do a kind of advanced rubric design workshop or webinar where I help you with some of the problems that you're having or some of the challenges that you've faced in rubric design. You can talk about creating rubrics for hours and hours and hours because it's an important process, but it also has a lot of complexities as well. So I would be happy to do another workshop, but before I do that, I'd like to have as many of you as possible get out there and try the rubrics and see how things are working in the classroom for you and what kind of challenges you have. And I'm looking at a couple of other questions in chat. One question, how to make students get accustomed to following the rubrics? Good. It's just a process like anything else in the classroom. The first time you do it, students are uncomfortable, it's new, it's different. Step by step by step, students start to learn that this is how the teacher works, this is how we are evaluated. It's a slow process, it's a step-by-step process with students. Students will definitely learn to trust and support the use of rubrics when they start to see that it's meaningful for their own learning. So take your time, work slowly, start simple with rubrics in the classroom. Don't overwhelm your students. Looking at other questions here. Are there any books that would help us to? Yes, about books. I'm going to work together with Yelena to share a collection of resources, materials that are available online, reading materials, and some other materials that I have developed here at the University of Oregon with respect to rubrics and rubric design. So I will be happy to share kind of a folder of rubric materials and reading with you shortly after this training so that you can have access to the materials to read there. So am I allowed? Yes, the answer is please share as much as possible. So anything I've said today, share with your colleagues. Anything you've learned from me in a course you've taken, share with your colleagues. I encourage as much sharing as possible. I will put my PowerPoint on the collection of resources as well, so you can take my PowerPoint and use it for your own purposes if you like in the future. So please, I'm very transparent in my own teaching and training. I like you to share as much as possible. So take anything that you find here that's useful and share it with your colleagues. I'd like to use it tomorrow, I see in the chat. Great, good, use it tomorrow. That sounds wonderful, I appreciate that. Okay, I don't see any other questions appearing in the chat. So, Yelena, shall we wrap up now? Is that reasonable?
Okay, so, and I think that for our feedback form, we should add one more spot where you can write your questions. Maybe you don't have some questions now, but they might arise after you go and try out the rubrics or any other things. So please make sure you complete the feedback form, and you are welcome to write your questions and comments also, because it will help us to meet your needs during our next webinars. And I think we can plan our webinar in the future on rubric design. And thank you very much, Andy, for speaking to us today and presenting. And so we will send all the materials as you promised to the participants, and you're welcome to share them with you, with your colleagues. So I would like to congratulate everybody with coming Merry Christmas and Happy New Year, because our next webinar will be in January the 17th, as usual on Wednesday. And I wish you all the best and good health and good luck and professional development.